Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. This is not going to be the last book that I read to you. I am very much enjoying this process. And we have reached the climax of the book, essentially a long, slow-motion climax of the book. In the last chapter, the odious Mr. Slope actually put his arm around the waist of the virtuous widow, Mrs. Bold, and she slugged him. Now, she took off. She couldn't, since Mr. Slope is not a gentleman, she couldn't assure herself that he would do the right thing, so she fled and has gone back to the big country house where there's this big country to-do where all of our characters are gathered together, including the Stanhope family. The prebendary, Dr. Vesey Stanhope, and his odd children. There's his daughter Madeline, the Signora Neroni, who's crippled but alluring. She likes to draw men into her web because she's incredibly beautiful. There's the daughter Charlotte, who is an automaton. She is a schemer. All of the Stanhopes, Trollope tells us right away, chapters and chapters ago, he tells us right away that the Stanhopes are basically sociopaths. All of them. They're friendly, and they can be wonderful to spend time with. Eleanor Bold has very much enjoyed spending her time with them, but they don't have any human parts to them. And that very much applies to the son and heir, Bertie Stanhope, who is a useless fop of a creature without a thought in his head and without a penny to his name, and who knows that he won't be getting any money from his father. His father is just earning a living at Barchester. It's a good living, but it's not enough to endow a family. So Bertie has to marry a wealthy widow. He has to marry someone wealthy. And he set his sights on Eleanor Bold, and with the full connivance of his family. Now, that connivance was completely full among his siblings. We don't know for sure how much his parents know, but his siblings were 100% on board with that whole program until just recently. Charlotte very much wants to see Bertie settled in the world, probably because that will help her. And the Signora Neroni was on board as well. Charlotte helps her quite a bit. She can't get around on her own. So she doesn't think it's advisable to antagonize her sister. That choking sound you hear is my little dog. She's over on the bed. She's going crazy because we are separated by 10 inches. So if you hear choking, that's what the sound is. But just recently, just a couple of chapters ago, we saw discussion between Mr. Arabin and the Signora, in which at the end of it, once she's laid bare his soul to him mercilessly, she decides to help him in his love of Eleanor Bold. So we don't know what's going to come of that. But we do know that at this big country party, Eleanor is surrounded by people who have designs on her, one way or another. Mr. Arabin probably would be unfair to say he has designs on her, but he does love her, and she loves him. But she has at least two people who want to pitch woo to her, want to propose marriage to her. One has already done so, Mr. Slope, and he has been as firmly rebuffed as someone could possibly be. But there's someone else, and she doesn't know it. She had no idea that all of her friends and relatives were right about Mr. Slope. And she has no inkling at all about Bertie Stanhope, none whatsoever. So when she runs from Mr. Slope, she encounters Charlotte Stanhope and automatically sighs a great sigh of relief. We know better. This is the point that I was making yesterday. I made this throughout this read-along, is that Trollope often informs the reader of things that he keeps from his characters, sometimes the whole of the book, sometimes forever. They never learn what the reader knows. I think he does a really skillful job of it. This is chapter 41. Mrs. Bold confides her sorrow to her friend Miss Stanhope. When Mrs. Bold came to the end of the walk and faced the lawn, she began to bethink herself what she should do. Was she to wait there till Mr. Slope caught her, or was she to go in among the crowd with tears in her eyes and passion in her face? She might in truth have stood there long enough without any reasonable fear of further immediate persecution from Mr. Slope, but we are all inclined to magnify the bugbears which frighten us. That most of the people in our story don't know that Mr. Slope, upon learning that the old dean of Barchester is dead and therefore the place is open, immediately decamped from the Ullathorne party and is headed back to Barchester. Most of our characters don't know that. In her present state of dread, she did not know of what atrocity he might venture to be guilty. Had anyone told her a week ago that he would have put his arm around her waist at this party of Miss Thorne's, she would have been utterly incredulous. Had she been informed that he would be seen on the following Sunday walking down the high street in a scarlet coat and top boots, she would not have thought it a phenomenon more improbable. But this improbable iniquity he had committed, and now there was nothing she could not believe of him. In the first place, it was quite manifest that he was tipsy. In the next place, it was to be taken as proof that all his religion was sheer hypocrisy. And finally, the man was utterly shameless. She therefore stood watching for the sound of his footfall, and not without some fear that he might creep out of her suddenly from among the bushes. Slope as boogeyman has been all throughout this book, but now it's laid bare for the world to see. As she thus stood, she saw Charlotte Stanhope at a little distance from her, walking quickly across the grass. Eleanor's handkerchief was in her hand, and putting it to her face so as to conceal her tears, she ran across the lawn to join her friend. "Oh, Charlotte," said she, almost too much out of breath to speak very plainly, "I'm so very glad I found you." "Glad you found me?" said Charlotte, laughing. "That's a good joke. Why, Bertie and I have been looking for you everywhere. He swears that you have gone off with Mr. Slope, and is now on the point of hanging himself." "Oh, Charlotte, don't." "Why, my child, what on earth is the matter with you?" said Miss Stanhope, perceiving that Eleanor's hand trembled on her own, and finding also that her companion was still half choked by tears. "Goodness heaven, something has distressed you. What is it? What can I do for you?" Eleanor answered her only by a sort of spasmodic gurgle in her throat. She was a good deal upset, as people say, and could not at the moment collect herself. "Come here, this way, Mrs. Bold. Come this way, and we shall not be seen. What has happened to vex you? What can I do for you? Can Bertie do anything?" "Oh, no, 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 no," said Eleanor. "There is nothing to be done. Only that horrid man." "What horrid man?" There are some moments in life in which both men and women feel themselves imperatively called upon to make a confidence, in which not to do so requires a disagreeable resolution and also a disagreeable suspicion. There are people of both sexes who never make confidences, who are never tempted by momentary circumstances to disclose their secrets, but such are generally dull, close, unimpassioned spirits, gloomy gnomes who live in cold, dark mines. There was nothing of the gnome about Eleanor, and she had therefore resolved to tell Charlotte Stanhope the whole story about Mr. Slope. But notice what Trollope is doing here. It's subtle. People don't associate subtlety with this guy, and I understand that. Red-faced, beefy, Britisher who, yelled at dinner tables and talked all the time about hunting to foxes. I understand why they don't attribute subtlety to him. But notice, he could have put that note about how there are come moments in our lives when we feel compelled to make a confidence. He could have put that note anywhere. He puts it here, not so much because Eleanor is yet feeling it, but because we ought to feel it. It's a reminder to us that Eleanor absolutely should not confide in Miss Stanhope. She absolutely should not. Now, that's going to become more explicit as the chapter goes on, but it's going to become more explicit once it comes to Eleanor's mind. It's being mentioned now, so it will be brought to our mind. Bean. Just, again, pardon the sound of choking. Anyway, this is not a very good read aloud, is it? But I'm having fun, and that's what counts. That horrid man, that Mr. Slope. Did you not see that he followed me out of the dining room? Of course I did, and I was sorry enough, but I could not help it. I knew you would be annoyed, but you and Bertie managed it badly between you. It was not his fault, nor mine either. You know how I dislike the idea of coming in the carriage with that man. I am sure I am very sorry if that has led to it. I don't know what has led to it, said Eleanor, almost crying again, but it has not been my fault. But what has he done, my dear? He's an abominable, horrid, hypocritical man, and it would serve him right to tell the bishop all about it. Believe me, if you want to do him an injury, you had far better tell Mrs. Proudie. But what did he do, Mrs. Bold? Ugh. Well, I must confess he's not very nice, said Charlotte Stanhope. Nice, said Eleanor. He's the most fulsome, fawning, abominable man I ever saw. What business had he to come to me? I that never gave him the slightest tittle of encouragement, that I always hated him, though I did take his part when others ran him down. That's just where it is, my dear. He has heard that, and therefore fancied that of course you were in love with him. This was wormwood to Eleanor. It was in fact the very thing which all her friends had been saying from the last month, and which experience now proved to be true. Eleanor resolved within herself that she would never again take any man's part. The world, with all its villainy and all its ill nature, might wag as it liked. She would not again attempt to set crooked things straight. "But what did he do, my dear?" said Charlotte, who was really rather interested in the subject. He, well, come on, it can't have been anything very hard, for the man was not tipsy. "Oh, I'm sure he was," said Eleanor. "I'm sure he must have been tipsy." "Well, I declare I didn't observe it. But what was it, my love?" "Why, I believe I can hardly tell you. He talked such hard stuff that you never heard the like about religion and heaven and love. Oh, he is such a nasty man." "I can easily imagine the sort of stuff he would talk. Well, and then?" "And then he took hold of me." "Took hold of you?" "Yes, he somehow got close to me and took hold of me." "By the waist?" "Yes." "And then?" "Then I jumped away from him and gave him a slap on the face and ran away along the path till I saw you." Charlotte Stanhope laughed heartily at the finale to the tragedy. It was delightful to her to think that Mr. Slope had had his ears boxed. She did not quite appreciate the feeling which made her friend so unhappy at the result of the interview. To her, thinking the matter had ended happily enough as regarded the widow, who was entitled to some sort of triumph among her friends, whereas Mr. Slope would be due all those jibes and jeers which would naturally follow such an affair. His friends would ask him whether his ears tingled whenever he saw a widow, and he would be cautioned that beautiful things were made to be looked at and not to be touched. Such were Charlotte Stanhope's views on the matter, but she did not at the present moment clearly explain them to Mrs. Bold. Her object was to endear herself to her friend, and therefore, having had her laugh, she was ready enough to offer sympathy. Could Bertie do anything? Should Bertie speak to the man, and warn him that in future he must behave with more decorum? Bertie, indeed, she declared, would be more angry than anyone else when he heard what insult Mrs. Bold had been subjected to. "But you won't tell him," said Mrs. Bold, with a look of horror. "Not if you don't like it," said Charlotte. "But of course she will. These people don't care about anything. So of course she will. She's just plainly lying. But consider everything. What I should strongly advise it. If you had a brother, you know, it would be unnecessary. But it is very right that Mr. Slope should know that you have somebody by you that will and can protect you." "But my father is here." That's what Mrs. Bold said, because her father, Mr. Harding, is there. No one he doesn't come to mind as a protector, but nevertheless. "Yes, but it is so disagreeable for clergymen to have to quarrel with each other. And the circumstances your father is just at the moment, it would be very inexpedient that there should be anything unpleasant between him and Mr. Slope. Surely you and Bertie are intimate enough for you to permit him to take your part." And what Charlotte means there is it would be wrong, it would be dicey for Mr. Harding to go against Mr. Slope, because Charlotte does not know. The reason why it would be dicey is because Mr. Slope has so much power in the diocese as the personal chaplain of the bishop, and might have even more if he becomes the dean. And what Charlotte doesn't know, what none of these characters know, is that none of that is going to happen. None of that. He is not welcome in the bishop's palace, and he will certainly not be dean. But Charlotte doesn't know that, so she's worried about Mr. Harding taking a part against Mr. Slope. Charlotte Stanhope was very anxious that her brother should at once, on that day, settle matters with his future wife. She doesn't actually care about Eleanor Bold at all. Things had now come to a point between him and his father, that is, Bertie Stanhope and Dr. Vesey Stanhope, and between him and his creditors, that he must either do so or leave Barchester. Either do that or go back to his unwashed associates, dirty lodgings, and poor living at Carrara in Italy. Unless he could provide himself with an income, he must go to Carrara or go to, and Trollope leaves it out, but it's the devil or hell. His father, the prebendary, had not said this in so many words, but had he done so, he could not have signified it more plainly. So Bertie is at the end. This has to happen, or else he goes bust, as the old phrase used to be. Such being the state of the case, it was very necessary that no more time should be lost. Charlotte had seen her brother's apathy when he neglected to follow Mrs. Bold out of the room, with anger which he could hardly suppress. It was grievous to think that Mr. Slope should have so distanced him. Charlotte felt that she had played her part with sufficient skill. She had brought them together and induced such a degree of intimacy that her brother was really relieved from all the trouble and labor in the matter. And moreover, it was quite plain that Mrs. Bold was very fond of Bertie. And now it was plain enough also that he had nothing to fear from his rival, Mr. Slope. They've never been rivals. She's not going to marry either one of them. Trollope's already told us that, but we would know that anyway. She considers Bertie Stanhope to be the equivalent of a gigantic golden retriever. There was certainly an awkwardness in subjecting Mrs. Bold to a second offer on the same day. Yeah, just a bit. It would have been well, perhaps, to have put the matter off for a week, but a week could not be spared. But circumstances are frequently too peremptory to be arranged as we wish to arrange them, and such was the case now. This being so, could not this affair of Mr. Slope's be turned to advantage? Could it not be made an excuse for bringing Bertie and Mrs. Bold into still closer connection, into such close connection that they would not fail to throw themselves into each other's arms? Such was the game which Miss Stanhope now at a moment's notice resolved to play. And very well she played it. In the first place, it was arranged that Mr. Slope should not return in the Stanhope's carriage to Barchester. They don't know that he's already gone, but it so happened that Mr. Slope was already gone, but of course of that they knew nothing. The Signora should be induced to go first, with only the servants and her sister, and Bertie should take Mr. Slope's place in the second journey. Bertie was to be told in confidence of the whole affair, and when the carriage was gone off with its first load, Eleanor was to be left under Bertie's special protection, so as to ensure her from any further aggression from Mr. Slope. While the carriage was getting ready, Bertie was to seek out that gentleman and make him understand that he must provide himself with another conveyance back to Barchester. Their immediate object should be to walk about together in search of Bertie. Bertie, in short, was to be the Pegasus on whose wings they were to ride out of their present dilemma. There was a warmth of friendship and cordial kindness in all this that was very soothing to the widow. But yet, though she gave way to it, she was hardly reconciled in doing so. It never occurred to her that now that she had killed one dragon, another was about to spring up in her path. She had no remote idea that she would have to encounter another suitor in her proposed protector, but she hardly liked the thought of putting herself so much in the hands of young Stanhope. She felt that if she wanted protection, she should go to her father. But she doesn't. She doesn't. How many times is she so clear on what her course of action should be, and then she doesn't take it? She felt that she should ask him to provide a carriage for her back to Barchester. Mrs. Clantarem, she knew, would give her a seat. She knew that she should not throw herself entirely upon friends whose friendship dated, as it were, from but yesterday. But yet she could not say no to one who was so sisterly in her kindness, so eager in her good nature, so comfortably sympathetic as Charlotte Stanhope, and thus she gave way to all the propositions before her. She could easily say no. She's upset. The natural thing would be to expect she would go straight to her father. She could easily do that. She just is a ninny. They first went into the dining room, looking for their champion, and from thence to the drawing room. Here they found Mr. Arabin still hanging over the Signora's sofa, or rather they found him sitting near her head as a physician might have sat had the lady been his patient. There were no other people present in the room. The guests were some in the tent, some still few in the dining room, some at the bows and arrows, but most of them walking with Miss Thorne through the park and looking at the games that were going on. All that had passed and was passing between Mr. Arabin and the lady it is unnecessary to give in detail. She was doing with him what she did with all others. It was her mission to make fools of men, and she was pursuing her mission with Mr. Arabin. She had almost got him to own his love for Mrs. Bold, and had subsequently almost induced him to acknowledge a passion for herself. He, poor man, was hardly aware of what he was doing or saying, hardly conscious whether he was in heaven or in hell. So little had he known of female attractions of that particular class which the Signora owned, that he became affected with a kind of temporary delirium when first subjected to its power. He lost his head rather than his heart, and toppled about mentally, reeling in his ideas as a drunken man does on his legs. She had whispered to him words that really meant nothing, but which, coming from such beautiful lips and accompanied with such lustrous glances, seemed to have a mysterious significance which he felt as though he could not understand. In being thus sirened, Mr. Arabin behaved himself rather differently from Mr. Slope. The Signora had said truly that the two men were contrasts of each other, that the one was all for action, and the other all for thought. Mr. Slope, when this lady laid upon his senses the overpowering breath of her charms, immediately attempted to obtain some fruition, to achieve some mighty triumph. He began by catching at her hand, and progressed by kissing it. He made vows of love and asked for vows in return. He promised everlasting devotion, knelt before her, and swore that had she been on Mount Ida, Juno would have had cause to hate her rather than Venus. This is a reference to the famous moment, the famous inciting incident in all of the Homeric cycle, where the gods are all feasting on Mount Olympus when someone throws a golden apple onto the table, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." And Athena comes forward, and Hera, Juno, comes forward, and also Venus comes forward as the only claimants. And Juno is incensed with jealousy over Venus, because of course she is the fairest. A scene that's rather remarkably done in my novel, Troy War. Let's just say you won't forget it very quickly. But anyway, I don't know, but remarkable. But Mr. Arabin uttered no oaths, kept his hand mostly in his trouser pockets, and had no more thought of kissing Madame Neroni than of kissing the Countess de Courcy, because he's a good man. That's the difference here that Madeline Neroni can't see, and Trollope is not spelling it out. But he's not a slime. As soon as Mr. Arabin saw Mrs. Bold enter the room, he blushed and rose from his chair. And then he sat down again, and then got up again. The Signora saw the blush at once, and smiled at the poor victim, but Eleanor was too much confused to see anything. "Oh, Madeline," said Charlotte, "I want to speak to you particularly. We must arrange about the carriage, you know." And she stooped down to whisper to her sister. Her sister's on a couch. She can't get up. She can't walk on her own. Mr. Arabin immediately withdrew to a little distance, and as Charlotte had in fact much to explain before she could make the new carriage arrangements intelligible, he had nothing to do but talk to Mrs. Bold. "We have had a very pleasant party," said he, using the tone he would have used to declare that the sun was shining very brightly or the rain falling very fast. It's the last thing in the world these two can do, is make small talk right now. And yet, what are you going to do if there's an empty space to fill? Trollope does it really well. He writes this ensuing dialogue every bit as painfully artificial as it surely was. If this had happened. Of course, this is made-up stories. But anyway, you fall under the spell, don't you? Very, said Eleanor, who never in her life had passed a more unpleasant day. "I hope Mr. Harding has enjoyed himself." "Oh, yes, very much," said Eleanor, who had not seen her father since she parted from him soon after her arrival. "He returns to Barchester tonight, I suppose?" "Yes, I believe so. That is, I think he's staying at Plumstead." That's Plumstead Episcopi, the home of Archdeacon Grantley, where we saw so many fireworks, where she had so many harsh words with everybody when they realized they all suspected her of favoring Mr. Slope. "Oh, staying at Plumstead," said Mr. Arabin. "He came from there this morning. I believe he's going back. He didn't exactly say, however. I hope Mrs. Grantley is well." "She seemed to be quite well. She's here, that is, unless she's gone away." "Oh, yes, to be sure. I was talking to her. Looking very well indeed." Then there was a considerable pause, for Charlotte could not at once make Madeline understand why she had to be sent home in a hurry without her brother. "Are you returning to Plumstead, Mrs. Bold?" Mr. Arabin merely asked this by way of making conversation, but he immediately perceived that he was approaching dangerous ground. "No," said Mrs. Bold very quietly. "I am going home to Barchester." "Oh, yes, I had forgotten that you had returned." She left in a huge furor. He's so malatoid. And then Mr. Arabin, finding it impossible to say anything further, stood silent till Charlotte had completed her plans, and Mrs. Bold stood equally silent, intently occupied, as it appeared, with the arrangement of her rings. And yet these two people were thoroughly in love with each other. And though one was middle-aged clergyman and the other a lady at any rate past the wishy-washy bread-and-butter period of life, they were as unable to tell each other their own minds as any other Damon and Phyllis, whose united ages could not make up that to which Mr. Arabin had already attained, which is Trollope's windy way of saying they're acting like moonstruck teenagers instead of adults. They're both adults. And they could just talk out their problems, but instead they are too awkward. Madeline Neroni consented to her sister's proposal, and then the two ladies went off again in quest of Bertie Stanhope. So that is chapter 41. That is all that happens, is that the only point of the chapter that we're really supposed to see here is that Eleanor Bold still does not suspect the Stanhopes. She is going to be presented with one brutal revelation after another here. She's rough-used by our author. Will those revelations push her into the arms of Mr. Arabin? We don't have many chapters more to go. We will find out next time. Maybe I'm the only one who's interested, but I love these books so much. So we'll find out next time. We're at chapter, what did we do again? I think we're at chapter 42. Yeah, we're at chapter 42 next time out of, I believe, 50 chapters. So sooner or later, we're going to have to decide on what our next read aloud is. Are we going to plow along with the next book in the series? We shall see. We shall see. I'm going to wrap this up for now, though, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.